Hello again, everyone. Today I wanted to talk to you about the old problem in ethics of egoism versus altruism, which we've been looking at. Egoism breaks down into two parts, psychological egoism and ethical egoism, as you may already know. Psychological egoism is not a theory of ethics proper. It really says that it's a theory of motivation saying that all people are selfish all the time. So it's something about our psyches that we can't help but do an unselfish act. We are always doing selfish acts. Even actions that appear to be selfish on the surface, the egoist would say, are done for one's own benefit. So you give to a charity, and perhaps you wanted to be the recognition for giving to the charity. Perhaps you wanted a tax write-off when the tax season comes. But you're never doing anything purely for the other. The counter-argument to egoism is presented by altruism. Altruism, the word altru means other, and altruism is the thesis that says at least some of the time we are capable of thinking of others and doing unselfish actions. So those are the two theses that butt heads here. If you take someone like Thomas Hobbes, the British philosopher, Hobbes is describing people, you must be clear about this, in a specified condition, the state of nature. The state of nature is before there is a civil society, and before the people in Hobbes' Leviathan agree to a social contract and appoint a sovereign and create laws to obey. They exist in this pre-societal state known as the state of nature. And in the state of nature, he says life will be nasty, brutish, and short. Why? Because there are no rules to go by. So he's describing people in that condition. He thinks without laws or covenants, there'll be no mine and thine. There'll be no sense of this belongs to you and this belongs to me. People can take one another's goods. Indeed, they will, because there'll be a condition of scarcity. Many people competing for few goods. And this will lead to tactics to survive by any means necessary. And so there is a kind of survival of the fittest mentality that would exist in this state of nature. And it's hard to argue that that wouldn't be the case. I mean, take away law and take away the repercussions for doing wrong, and what will be the result of that? It would seem that people would do wrong with impunity, without repercussions, without having to pay the price for them. And so this is the thesis of psychological egoism. Alongside that thesis is ethical egoism. The two are not to be confused, by the way. Even if you believe in psychological egoism, that does not imply ethical egoism, and vice versa. If ethical egoism, which states, I ought to state it right now, that we ought to benefit only ourselves, forget about whether we do or not. Even if we don't, we ought to. Our only obligation, in other words, our only moral obligation is to benefit ourselves, to look out for number one, as the saying goes, and I have no obligations to you and you have none to me. Well, just notice the logical relationship between psychological egoism, PE, and ethical egoism, EE. If you're a psychological egoist, that does not imply that you believe that we ought to be that way. Psychological egoism is descriptive. It just describes the way people are. And if you're an ethical egoist, you're prescribing. It's prescriptive because you're saying this is the way people ought to be. Does not imply that's the way they are. So the PE does not imply EE, and EE does not imply PE. You could say, if you wanted to see what the logical relation is. So the thesis is that people are selfish all the time if you're a psychological egoist. And if you're saying that people are selfish all the time and always have been in the history of the world, there's never been an unselfish action. Of course, logically, we should realize that to defeat that position, we only need one counterexample. And that's what the altruist is out to prove, that there are many such examples. There are examples of people risking their own lives by diving into the ocean to save someone drowning. There was a famous case in the subway of New York where a person dove onto the tracks to save a man who had a seizure and had fallen on the tracks. And he lay on top of him, pulled his arms in so they wouldn't be severed by the oncoming train. He risked his life. And he was amply rewarded as a kind of hero. Thereafter, people got to know who he was, and he was celebrated in a State of the Union address by then President George Bush 43. And many good things came his way. But the altruist will say, see, there's your counterexample. There are examples like that where people are not thinking of themselves and are capable of doing grand things for others. The egoist, of course, will reply, no, he had to do that. He would have felt guilty if he didn't try to help the man who had the seizure. And he might have been aware that there'd be some reward. He probably hoped that people would praise him for it. I don't know, at this point, he had only half a second, a fraction of a second to act and decide to dive on those tracks because the train was coming. Did he really calculate that in the aftermath he'd be on late night shows and people would be sending checks to him for his daughters? He left 2 daughters standing on the platform, both under the age of 10 at the time. They could have been without a father had this not had his attempt to save the other man fail. Could he really have calculated that all this good fortune would come his way? It's hard to believe, but that's what the egoist will say. So altruism likes to point out that there are not just extraordinary selfless acts like that, but everyday kind of selfless actions too. And the altruist also likes to point out some confusion in the egoist position. One of the confusions is the confusion between self-interest and selfishness. Egoists will often point out that we always act out of self-interest. Well, we have to be clear about what selfishness means as opposed to self-interest. But even if that was the case, even if it were true that people always act from a motive of self-interest, that does not imply that egoism is true. Self-interest means that you're doing something that's in your best interest, but it isn't necessarily selfish. Notice, if you have an abscessed tooth and you need to take care of that tooth before the pain gets too great or the problem gets greater, an infection occurs, just because you go to the dentist to take care of that tooth doesn't mean you've been selfish. You've acted out of self-interest because you want to nip this problem in the bud. But that's not necessarily selfish. I'd like to point out another confusion that that egoists make, psychological egoists. This is the confusion between motive and the aftermath. In the case I just mentioned of the man who in 2007 dove on the subway tracks to save a stranger, they like to say, see, all these good things came his way, and the material rewards and recognition came his way, and now he's famous. He was even depicted in an ethics book I used to use in my classes. But that's not the way the egoist can win the position. If you think of the motive for an action, the action, and then the consequence of the action, they would have to show that he was being selfish at the motive stage, even before he acted, and before, certainly before the aftermath, where all these good things came his way, recognition, fame, and wealth. As it turned out, he went on a speaking junket. He would get good sums of money to speak. But to point that out doesn't prove that he was selfishly motivated, notice. So I like to call that second confusion the confusion between motive and consequence, or motive and aftermath. They can't win the argument that way. They would have to show at the time he acted, he was thinking selfishly. And he said afterward, it's in the New York Times, he said afterward, no, I just thought it was the right thing to do. I'm not a hero. A third thing we should notice about this debate is what the altruist is trying to do. If you think of what the egoist is saying, it's saying all actions are selfish all the time. When we start a sentence with all, like all capital punishment is just, or all euthanasia is unjust, or sentences of these sort, all and no, all sentences are called universal affirmatives. Sentences that begin with no are called universal negatives. And how many examples do you need to defeat those sentences? Just one contrary example. If you say all capital punishment is unjust, and I say, what about Timothy McVeigh, the Oklahoma City bomber, who killed 160 plus people by setting off that fertilizer bomb in Oklahoma City in April of 1995. So I'm trying to come up with one counterexample to defeat your all statement. And that's all that needs to be done in order to defeat the egoist position here. Another thing that we should point out that seems problematic about the egoist position is that they like to point out that people often get this pleasant sensation or peace of mind from doing a good action, as if that somehow undermines it and sullies the action. James Rachels, a very clear thinker and clear writer, in an essay called Egoism and Moral Skepticism, says, well, that's the way it should be. You should feel good about doing a good action. if you're wired right, as it were, you're supposed to be get some satisfaction from doing good for others. That doesn't sully the action at all. In fact, it's the selfish person who is pained, finds it painful to do a good action for someone else, and so you have to look at that and say, why are they not getting any pleasure? Well, because it's not about them. But if you're altruistic, you're supposed to feel good about doing a generous action. So just pointing out this satisfaction doesn't prove anything at all. It doesn't win points for the egoist position. One more thing to be pointed out here is that in this regard, there's the famous example of Abe Lincoln being on the train, and in fact the story goes that he was discussing this very issue with his fellow passenger, whether egoism or altruism was true. And outside the train window, these pigs caught about to drown in a pool of water, and the train stops, and Lincoln gets off and helps the pigs out so they won't drown. And his friend says, "See, Abe, you did a very unselfish thing." And Abe said back to him, "No, I wouldn't have been able to live with myself. I would have felt guilty the whole day if I hadn't done something to save those pigs." Rachel's settles this issue to my satisfaction. He says that what was Lincoln's object in what he did? Was his object to benefit himself, or was his object to benefit the pigs? Clearly implying that it's the latter. His object was to help the pigs. And if that was his object, then his object was selfless and altruistic. As a consequence of doing that selfless thing, he felt good in the aftermath, but that doesn't mean that that's what he was trying to do. He wasn't trying to assuage his own guilt. He was trying to help these animals. So I think it's always been an interesting issue. It's one of these issues in philosophy where getting clear about terminology helps, and clear thinking helps. And James Rachels, who was the head of the philosophy department at the University of Alabama, and also a best-selling author as a philosopher, was a master of clear expression and clear thinking. So in his article, Egoism and Moral Skepticism, I think he settles a lot of these issues and really clarifies the different points in the debate. So that's all for now, and I will see you soon, I hope. Have a good day.